My Lords, first of all, I'd like to thank Baroness Wall for bringing this debate to the House. It's a topic which I have a great interest in. At the tail end of 2008, I was invited by the government to head an advertising campaign to promote apprenticeships. Now, before agreeing to do so, I decided to research the message that needed to be projected, and I concluded that the campaign needed to be directed at employers as well as prospective apprentices, because it was clear to me that there was a lack of understanding as to what was on offer to both the employer and the employee. Now, in the early part of 2009, the campaign went to air and created a lot of interest. In fact, hits to the apprenticeship website rose from 52,000 to 120,000 per week. It also created 4,000 firm inquiries. It's important to note that back in 1997, there were just 60,000 apprenticeships. But by May 2009, there were 250,000, and encouragingly, with a completion ratio of around 70%. Now, this is an undisputed statistic. This rise came about under the last government. Now, I've heard that the pre-election promise of the current government, pledging 400,000 apprenticeships over the next 2 years, has been somewhat watered down. What we have to avoid, by all means, is undoing all of the hard work of the past. Any proposed government cuts should not be directed at this sector. Indeed, cutting funding for training would be a repetition of the mistakes made during the last recession. Now, in 2009, I held 4 seminars on apprenticeships where I spoke to audiences of employers in London, Birmingham, Leeds and Newcastle. And at these meetings, the frequent comment from employers was that they would employ more apprentices if the government were to give them some financial incentive. Now, my Lords, whilst I could not agree with them at those particular meetings at the time, I would have to admit now that I do agree with them. Right now, the money provided by government to pay for training of apprentices goes to fund colleges and so-called learning providers. Now, while I believe these establishments are needed to a certain extent to cater for things like day release, I question full-time courses in manufacturing or any other physical skilled trade. Now, my Lords, I am confident on what I'm about to say now will not be disputed by any of your Lordships, no matter what profession your Lordships embarked upon and what academic qualifications you attained. I am sure your Lordships will agree that you have gained virtually all of your knowledge and experience by actually working in your chosen occupation. And therein lies the key to where any government funding must go. We must encourage employers to train people. To do that, they have to employ them. In any industry that requires skills, be it manufacturing, building, software development, there's a need to grow your own labour force to make sure the staff are instilled with your firm's culture and, more to the point, loyalty. However, let me say now what others might be frightened of admitting. Whilst it's important to train staff to grow a future workforce, the reality is that every person you train requires an experienced member of staff to mentor them. In fact, experience has shown from my own companies that to do it properly, the mentor has to devote a lot of time to the individual before he or she can be let loose, so to speak. The fact is, while members of staff are mentoring, they can't be doing their own jobs fully, and therefore training the newcomer doesn't just cost the salary you are paying, albeit minimum wage. More importantly, it's the cost of loss of time of the experienced staff. And so your Lordships might see why employers are saying, well, you know, okay, we will take on and train young people, but we want you the government to pay us or compensate us in some way. And I think in this day and age, when most businesses are having to tighten their belts to fight their way out of recession, they can ill afford to have their staff deflected. My Lords, trust me when I tell you that from my experience of taking on young people from college or other so-called training facilities, when they enter my company, they really know nothing. In my experience, they learn while they earn. I conclude that the young people will get a far more satisfaction and motivation from actually working in a firm rather than sitting in a classroom theorising. The government needs to think hard on how they can divert money from training facilities to employers. After all, some of these training facilities are not government owned, and the government simply sends they simply send a bill to the government for every apprentice that passes through their hands. Now, there are clever enough people in the government to work out ways to either create tax breaks or award grants to companies, small and large, instead of what I consider is blowing it on these so-called further education facilities. Now, instead, let's look what's happening. Right now, the government and the taxpayer, in fact, are playing out a bit of a charade by providing a place for young people to go and hide for a while. The government is giving money to training providers to avoid the overall embarrassment of having people out on the street. But in reality, all they're doing is delaying the inevitable, because the end product in many cases is still unemployable and unskilled. The young people will have greater dignity if they are taken into a firm and given a real goal to aim for. But don't expect the firms to do it for nothing. Whilst they may get the benefit of a trade employee eventually, anyone saying that an apprenticeship means cheap labour is totally deluded. Now, I see I'm not running out of time here, so I'll throw in a last curved ball, which is a completely different subject. One final thing that the government might do to promote apprenticeships is to ensure, by way of contractual agreement, that firms awarding government contracts must employ a proportion of apprentices.